It's the return of the double feature as we examine two arcade ports. These games come from the two most famous arcade game makers, as they both debut on Nintendo's new console, after a decade of animosity now thawing, and as the arcade markets melt away in the face of home consoles. Both Sega and Namco are two of the oldest and most influential players in the Japanese gaming market, both of which date their arcade roots back to the 1950s, prior to the introduction of video games. For the following half-century, both companies would stalk one another like a snake and a mongoose. When one had a brand new idea that shook up the arcade scene, the other would put its own spin on it with a rival take on the concept. Back and forth they would duel, as the two main leaders in arcade games. Although Sega was certainly the larger and more successful in that it parried its success in the arcade market into a role as a console maker, and thus held the keys to its own platforms. Namco would be left to bring its games to the home consoles of its arcade competitors, Sega and Nintendo. However, Nintendo was not much of a big player in the arcade market, aside from the first Donkey Kong game. Namco got the opportunity to get in on the very ground floor of the home console market with Nintendo, as it became the very first third-party company to sign up to publish games for the Famicom in Japan, and as a result, it got very favorable licensing terms from a Nintendo initially desperate to build support for its nascent system. However, after that 5-year agreement ran out in 1989, Namco expected to re-up that initial agreement along similar terms, only to find the now dominant market leader Nintendo taking a hard nose and telling its first third-party partner to now fall in line and accept the same contract every other company received. This seeming affront to the company and degradation of their initial role in helping build up Nintendo's success led Namco to throw a public punch in the usually sedate and controlled Japanese business environment, with Namco's founder and president, Masaya Nakamura, publicly accusing Nintendo of having and abusing its monopoly over the Japanese home console market, to which Nintendo's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, reportedly said that the market was perfectly open, and Namco was free to introduce its own game console if it wished to compete with Nintendo, and release its games on its own terms. In response to this corporate blow-up between the two companies, Namco also became one of the first big third-party companies to throw its support behind Sega's new Mega Drive system. Although they could not entirely abandon Nintendo's platforms, since Nintendo had such a big stranglehold on the North American and Japanese markets, that it would be financial suicide to limit its software to the still tiny Mega Drive audience. Still, the company branched out and seemed to never forget Nintendo's cold indifference to its early partnership. However, Sega's platforms were an imperfect place for Namco to put its games, since, as Sega's primary arcade nemesis, they would be at a bit of a disadvantage marketing some of their own games, since there would be a comparable or even superior Sega game to many of them. So as soon as a new option opened up, Namco once again took the chance to start from square one with the newcomer in the market, this time with Sony and its PlayStation. Here, Namco finally found the partnership they had been looking for, as not only were they welcomed with open arms by Sony to bring its hit arcade games over to the PlayStation, but without Sega on the platform along with them, they would be the predominant player there when it came to many arcade-centric genres. They went a long way towards filling the gap for Sony in its early years with the PlayStation, when the company had no relative history or experience in games like Nintendo or Sega had. While the Saturn would have Daytona USA, the PlayStation would get Ridge Racer. The world-famous Virtua Fighter that started the 3D fighting genre came to the Saturn, but was countered by Tekken on the PlayStation. And Sega's fantastic Virtua Cop series would be sadly overshadowed by Time Crisis on the PlayStation, thanks to that system's vast success over Sega's 32-bit console. In fact, Namco's partnership with Sony would be so close and so deep that they would do the reverse of Sega and would take Sony's console and turn it into an arcade platform when it started making the Namco System 10 board, which was based off the original Sony PlayStation. It would do the same thing when the PlayStation 2 came around, making the System 246 board, very closely akin to Sega's Naomi platform based on the Dreamcast. With such a close partnership tying them virtually at the hip to one of the console manufacturers, Namco no longer needed to play ball with Nintendo or Sega, and the company would release no games on the Saturn or Nintendo 64 for the rest of the 1990s, at least in North America. As a new decade and millennium dawned, Sony now held the throne as the king of the console market, and the arcade business was circling the drain. Namco began to thaw its relationship with both of the original console companies. They started out making a few token ports of some of their titles for the Dreamcast and Nintendo 64, such as Ms. Pac-Man Maze Madness or a Namco Museum title. Sega would entice them with financial and marketing support to bring a major launch title to the Dreamcast in the form of Soul Calibur, while Nintendo would entice them to bring Ridge Racer to the Nintendo 64 some 5 years after the PlayStation by developing it themselves, giving the job to Nintendo Software Technology, making it a virtual no-brainer for Namco. With the new generation of consoles getting started, Sega was now no longer a platform maker, being replaced by Microsoft. Nintendo was now far from the dominant position it held a decade earlier, and the arcade business was dying off. So Namco needed to open itself up and diversify its portfolio of platforms. It did just that by announcing pretty much across-the-board support for all 3 next-gen systems. For Sony, this was nothing new. For Microsoft, this was a helpful vote of support from a Japanese studio, where the Xbox would need all the help it could get. For Nintendo, this signaled a possible end to the long-running feud that stretched back a decade. Namco had announced at Space World 2001 that it would be bringing major franchises like Soul Calibur and Ridge Racer to the GameCube, the first time in a very long time that it would be supporting Nintendo's system with anything more than just token ports or compilations. However, these games would not be the first of Namco's to arrive on the system. They would instead seemingly test the waters of the GameCube with a simpler arcade game that once again might be seen as them zigging where Sega zagged. That game would be Smashing Drive. Now, Smashing Drive is not actually a direct programming result of Namco's internal teams. Rather, it's actually the creation of a little Spanish game development company called Galco that made arcade titles from the early 1990s into the mid-2000s. In fact, Smashing Drive actually had a spiritual predecessor in their lineup, with the also zany fast delivery game Radical Bikers, which hit arcades in 1998 and actually also got a PAL-exclusive PlayStation 1 release in 1999 as well. Although in our case of considering the console port of this arcade game, the actual conversion job was handled by another small development studio called Point of View, who had carved out their niche in the industry lately by doing conversions of Midway's games for consoles, such as working on the PlayStation 1 versions of the Ready to Rumble boxing series. So it seemed a good go-to studio for arcade to console conversions. Smashing Drive kicks off with an intro that's really more of an attract mode carried over directly from the arcade game. The one thing it makes clear is that this game does not take itself seriously, as it introduces your car like it's Batman perched on the edge of a building, and then descends on the mad city the game takes place around. It even ends on a high score screen, and then launches into a how-to-play video loop. It's pretty clear this is likely the most straight-to-console port of an arcade game we've seen yet. This continues to carry over as we're presented with a 4-choice menu. One of these is the options, but you'd really have to wonder if it even needed to be included, since it just has the controller settings, which let you turn on or off rumble, and the sound mode, which lets you just choose between mono and stereo sound. That's it for the options. One of the 4 modes is the multiplayer head-to-head mode, where you split screens and play the game with another person. That leaves the 2 remaining modes for a single player to sit down and play: the arcade mode and the survival mode. So from here we get to see what kind of game Smashing Drive is. Despite the prominent use of a taxi, this isn't another copy of Crazy Taxi. It's a racing game, of sorts. You're set up in a rolling start, with your computer opponent starting out ahead of you. The goal is simply to get to the end of the route before your competitor. But this is also an arcade game, so there's an added time clock as well. So you have 2 mechanics you need to handle to win. Once you get up to speed, you find that the streets of this game are relatively packed with traffic. There are cars right and left, and you need to be incredibly nimble, something I was not, in order to navigate the streets without getting slowed down by plowing through pedestrian cars all of the time. The antidote to this is usually the power-up bubbles scattered throughout the levels pretty generously, which gives you things like turbo boosts, flight wings, or destructive powers like monster truck wheels or a snowplow in the front of your vehicle. The maps aren't perfectly linear, as it's also littered with shortcuts you can take, if you find them. although they may not be as apparent as you might think, and you'll probably occasionally run into an invisible wall where you could swear that looked like a possible route. But whether you take the main routes or the shortcuts, you'll find this game really doesn't take itself seriously, as you take some crazy paths, such as driving up or through buildings, off roads or over bridges, all while plowing through pedestrians that run from your wheels. It's a bit of a mix between Crazy Taxi and San Francisco Rush. But like both those games, that also means it's pretty short on content. The intro menu shows you the 4 stages there are to race, and there's nothing else hiding here. That's it. Once you finish those 4 races, that's the end of the game. So naturally, it's rather difficult to actually do this. You'd have to play pretty consistently to learn the maps, master your skills with the control, and squeeze out the seconds needed to make it to the end goal in time. This is, after all, a very direct translation of an arcade game, so each time over was originally an opportunity for the game to get a few more quarters out of you. So what about that other mode, the survival mode? This is the same set of races as the arcade mode, just with an additional 3rd constraint on your gameplay. Now, the damage bar that existed in the arcade mode actually matters. While I depleted my damage bar on pretty much every arcade mode run, it never went to 0. You're virtually invulnerable in this mode. Not in survival mode. Now you can also blow up when you empty your damage bar, ending your run just as definitively as running out of time. So survival mode is just a harder version of the arcade mode, just without the added fun of plowing through stuff, making an absolute mess of things. Not only is this a direct arcade port in terms of its content, presentation, and gameplay, but also in terms of its graphics. This being an arcade game from 2000, it's a bit dated showing up on the GameCube in 2002. It really looks like a game visually landing somewhere between a late Nintendo 64 game and an early Dreamcast game. It's not especially great looking. The building models are fairly simple and blocky, the textures are a bit low res, and the skybox is a simple color gradient. But the game does run perfectly fine. It's colorful and high velocity in action. It just shows its age quite strongly, which could be said of the whole package. It's a solid, straightforward port of an outdated arcade game, but absolutely nothing more. It's short, it's not graphically impressive, and it can be unapologetically tough in order to extend playtime. If you like a fair little arcade racer, I can see where it would get its fans. But I can also just as easily understand its pretty muted reception critically, and its forgotten status, as it was really quite an anachronism by its own time. Now, as we've covered before, Namco was not the only company that had appointed itself as a nemesis to Nintendo in the early 90s that was now burying the hatchet and settling in on the GameCube. Sega had been the most famous of Nintendo's nemeses as a console maker, but now that its own position as a platform holder was gone with the wind, it was time to salvage what they could from the Dreamcast and try to get some return on their investment by bringing their games to other systems. Although in this particular case, Sega themselves wouldn't have to do anything, as the rights were already in someone else's hands. During our Crazy Taxi episode, we talked about the fact that during the summer of 2000, when Sega was still trying to push the Dreamcast as hard as they could, rumors started to break out across the internet that Acclaim had somehow acquired the rights to port Sega games to the PS2, and Crazy Taxi was one of those. Well, another of those was 18-wheeler American Pro Trucker. We also covered in the Crazy Taxi episode that Sega's arcade developers had a rough theme for some of its late 90s to early 2000 arcade titles it called the Real Careers series, which gamified usually unglamorous or very serious occupations like firefighters, safari hunts, taxi drivers, and ambulance drivers. Another of these games that slipped out into arcades at this time was 18-wheeler, courtesy of the king of Sega's arcade repertoire, AM2. This game showed up in arcades in early 2000, right as Crazy Taxi was hitting the Dreamcast and racking up strong sales, which no doubt played a role in this seemingly oddball title getting Sega's stamp of approval to port to the Dreamcast, as well as hoping to catch some of that Crazy Taxi magic, a fate none of the other Real Careers games would enjoy. In fact, Sega of America showed 18-wheeler at E3 2000 with online play included, as they were trying to push their SegaNet service with as many games as they could at the time. However, with the demise of the Dreamcast in early 2001, these plans, like so many others, began to wither away. The game made its release in Japan with no online play present, and then followed this up in the US with that feature removed. It was also not given the kind of warm critical and commercial reception that Crazy Taxi had, as it was seen as a fairly bare-bones port with no additional value or modes added for home players. Plus, this game ran at 30 frames per second, which tends to hamstring quick and speedy arcade racing games like this one. The other shoe to drop was that 18-wheeler American Pro Trucker was also on the shortlist of games that Acclaim had the rights to publish for other platforms. So just 6 months after the game arrived on the Dreamcast, a straightforward, nearly identical port arrived on the PlayStation 2. And then, just 3 months after that, on February 20th, 2002, Acclaim followed that up with a release on the GameCube, just like they had done with Crazy Taxi. So this version of the game opens with an Acclaim logo, followed by another arcade attract mode done in-engine, setting up 18-wheeler as some kind of action drama between competing truck drivers. We're delivered to another pretty sparse menu screen showing a few gameplay modes, the scoreboard, and the options. The options here are also pretty much the same. A save load function, turn on or off rumble, and change the audio standard. Although there's now a difficulty slider here too. Regardless of what game mode you choose, you get to choose from the standard AM2 style of American caricature characters, and then hit the road. Now, 18-wheeler has the same gameplay style as Smashing Drive. You're taking a one-way trip through a wacky, heightened world with both a time clock and a competing driver to stay ahead of. In this case, you're traversing a heavily condensed version of the United States, as you navigate from places like Florida to New York in just a matter of minutes. A nice mechanic in this game is that in addition to passing the checkpoints to extend your time, the road also occasionally produces specially marked vehicles that you can smash up in order to get a few extra seconds added to the clock, which can certainly make a difference on tight runs. The graphics here are at least a big step up from Smashing Drive, as the environments are more stylistic and detailed, with equally wacky stuff flying by, like tornadoes touching down all around you. The roads are less congested with traffic getting in your way. The only thing I personally dislike in a racing game, although I know it's because they're being true to their attempts at simulating truck driving, is the need to manually upshift and downshift your truck while driving. This is clearly more of a silly arcade racing game than a serious simulation. I'd personally rather focus on just nailing the gas to the floor and driving, but I know this is a personal preference thing, and that can also add some extra degrees of control and immersion to what you're doing. It's just not one of my favorite mechanics, but do note that it is there. When you finish a run, you're greeted with this game's signature unique and quirky flourish, the parking mode. Here you're given a very small course with the goal of quickly navigating your truck there in the short time given and then parking your truck within the given 3D space highlighted in green. It's quick, frantic, amusing, fun, and silly. Possibly the most fun part of the game. In fact, it's got its own mode right from the main menu, with the parking mode, letting you practice running the gauntlet of these challenges. The other mode on the main menu is the score attack, where you're put on a big 3-lap looping track and are challenged to rack up the biggest score you can, both by keeping your play time to a minimum to get the excess time back on your score, as well as by running down those specially marked cars. This time, they're worth points towards your score. The split-screen multiplayer mode takes the score attack and pits you against a friend to see who can rack up the highest score. 18-wheeler certainly offers a bit more variety in gameplay than Smashing Drive does, but that's probably the lowest bar any game has had to clear so far in this series. It's also a pretty thin game. It's just more abundant in comparison. But it's also still a fun, quick pick-up-and-play arcade game for a round or two. But it's also earned its nickname as a poor man's Crazy Taxi. It certainly doesn't have the same fun gameplay hook as its big brother, or those wonderful licensed soundtracks too. This becomes evident on the sales front as well. While VG Charts has software sales for the GameCube and PS2 versions of 18-wheeler American Pro Trucker, they do not have Dreamcast sales data. So I did my best to cobble some together from various forums and blog posts, but these numbers are entirely unverified and unsourced. This leads to a widely expected sales blowout between the market leader and the third-place contender, as the PlayStation 2 version has a little over 400,000 unit sales recorded, to the GameCube's 110,000 units sold. Both of these versions were only published by Acclaim in North America and Europe, so there are no Japanese sales numbers for these versions since it wasn't released over there on the PS2 and the GameCube. If the sketchy reports I found are to be trusted though, the Dreamcast version sold around 100,000 units in North America and 20,000 in Japan. Plus, there was a European release for which I was unable to find even speculative data. But just the Japanese and North American sales combined are more than the GameCube version sales, meaning that with the unknown number of European sales folded in, this game sold better in the last months of Sega's dying console than it did during the entire lifespan of Nintendo's. On the bright side for GameCube fans, Smashing Drive actually managed to do better on the GameCube than on the Xbox, as the GameCube version sold 70,000 units compared to the Xbox's 40,000 units. Although sales that low on any platform aren't really anything to be proud of. It's surprisingly poetic that these two games landed here on the GameCube just days apart, like twins separated at birth. Here was Namco and Sega, two arcade rivals long locked in a back-and-forth struggle for supremacy of their respective form of gaming, finally realizing that the arcades were a spent force and settling down on the platform hosted by their former nemesis, Nintendo. In this case, neither game was the absolute cream of the crop that these purveyors of arcade-style gaming had to show, but were simply serviceable ports, brought out to try and extend the return on investment into some otherwise forgotten arcade games.
With my